The bustling airport terminal was alive with the hum of travelers. It was an ordinary day for the flight crew preparing to board Flight 673, a routine trip from New York to Los Angeles. Among them was Claire, a senior flight attendant known for her impeccable professionalism, but also her sharp, sometimes overly strict demeanor. She prided herself on maintaining the highest standards in her cabin and ensured that passengers adhered to the rules, no exceptions. As passengers began to file into the plane, Claire's practiced smile greeted each one. Families with children, business people with sleek briefcases, and a few lucky ones heading to the luxury of first class streamed past her. She paid special attention to the elite seating area. First class was her domain, her pride. It was where she ensured only the right kind of people would enjoy the exclusive perks. It was then that her eyes landed on an older man standing near the entrance to the first-class cabin. He looked to be in his late 70s, dressed simply in a worn navy jacket, a button-down shirt, and khaki slacks. His hair was speckled with gray, and he carried a modest leather bag over one shoulder. There was nothing about him that screamed first-class passenger, and Claire's gaze lingered on him for a beat longer than necessary. Something about him seemed out of place. The man, however, appeared calm and composed. He smiled politely at the other passengers shuffling past, occasionally stepping aside to make room. When it was his turn to move forward, he handed over his boarding pass with a steady hand. Claire took it, her brow furrowing as she scanned the ticket. To her surprise and slight annoyance, it showed Seat 1A First Class. Claire's smile tightened as she looked back at the man. "Sir," she said, her tone laced with a hint of doubt, "are you sure this is your seat? First class is at the front of the plane." The man nodded, his voice kind but firm. "That's correct. This is my seat." She hesitated for a moment, glancing at the other passengers who were now watching the interaction with mild curiosity. There was a beat of silence before she handed the ticket back, though her expression betrayed her skepticism. As the man settled into his plush first-class seat, Claire couldn't shake the nagging feeling that he didn't belong there. Perhaps it was his unassuming demeanor or the way he seemed unaffected by the luxuries surrounding him. Whatever it was, her instincts told her something was off. Moments later, as the rest of the passengers found their seats, Claire discreetly approached one of her colleagues in the galley. "That gentleman in 1A," she whispered, glancing toward the first-class cabin. "Have you ever seen anyone like him in first class before?" Her colleague shrugged. "Not really, but if he has a ticket, what's the issue?" Claire shook her head. "I'm not sure. It just doesn't add up." The boarding process continued, but Claire couldn't let it go. Each time she walked through the first-class cabin, she found herself glancing at the man, searching for clues about who he was and why he was there. He didn't seem to fit the profile of the typical first-class passenger, at least not in her mind. Then came the moment that set everything in motion. As the plane taxied down the runway, Claire noticed the man take out an old leather-bound notebook. He began writing, his pen moving across the pages with a practiced hand. From her vantage point, she could see he wasn't jotting down notes or making lists. It looked more personal, almost reflective. Her curiosity got the better of her. During the beverage service, she stopped at his seat and leaned in slightly. "Writing anything interesting?" she asked, her tone casual but probing. The man looked up, a twinkle of amusement in his eyes. "Just some memories," he replied. That answer only deepened her intrigue. Who was he? And what kind of memories was he jotting down in that old notebook? As the flight progressed, Claire's suspicions grew. She decided she needed to act, convinced that something wasn't right. When the plane reached cruising altitude, she approached the man again, this time with a firmer tone. "Sir, I need to see your ticket one more time." He looked at her, his expression calm but questioning. "Is there a problem?" "Just a routine check," Claire replied, though the tension in her voice betrayed her. Reluctantly, the man handed over his boarding pass. Claire inspected it again, looking for any irregularities, but everything seemed in order. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that he didn't belong. That's when she made a decision that would change the course of the flight and her understanding of the man entirely. "I'm sorry, sir," she said, her voice cold and unwavering. I'm going to have to ask you to move to another seat. There's been a mistake." The cabin fell silent as passengers turned to watch the unfolding drama. The man's calm demeanor faltered for the first time, a flicker of confusion crossing his face. "A mistake," he repeated. "Yes," Claire insisted. "This seat isn't meant for you." And just like that, she ushered him out of the first-class cabin, directing him toward a seat in the economy section. The whispers among the other passengers grew louder, but Claire paid them no mind. She felt she had done the right thing, preserved the sanctity of first class. Little did she know, in just 7 minutes, she would learn exactly who the man was, and it would leave her, and everyone else on board, stunned. The man walked slowly down the aisle, his head held high despite the whispers and sideways glances from the other passengers. His steps were steady, dignified even, as though he had been through far worse than being asked to move seats. He found his new seat near the back of the plane, close to the engine's low hum. It wasn't nearly as comfortable as first class, but he settled in without complaint, placing his notebook carefully in the seat pocket in front of him. Claire, meanwhile, returned to her duties in first class, feeling a mix of satisfaction and unease. Something about the whole situation didn't sit right with her, though she couldn't pinpoint why. She reassured herself that she was only doing her job, maintaining order and ensuring that the standards of first class were upheld. Still, a small voice in the back of her mind questioned whether she acted too hastily. As the flight progressed, passengers whispered about the incident. Most didn't know what had happened, but they'd seen the quiet, elderly man being asked to move and couldn't help but speculate. A few passengers in first class exchanged knowing looks, as if to say, asterisk, he didn't belong here anyway, asterisk. Others in economy were more sympathetic, shaking their heads at what they perceived as an unnecessary display of authority. The man, however, remained composed. He sat quietly, gazing out the window as clouds drifted by, a faint smile playing on his lips. He seemed unaffected by the whispers or the glances, as though he was used to being underestimated. In the galley, Claire found herself unable to let it go. She tried to shake off her doubts, but her mind kept drifting back to the man. There was something about him, his calmness, his quiet confidence, that didn't align with her initial impression. She couldn't help but wonder if she'd made a mistake. During the meal service, Claire found herself near the man's seat once again. She glanced down and noticed his notebook sticking out of the pocket. She hesitated for a moment before asking, "Can I get you anything, sir?" He looked up, his kind eyes meeting hers. "No, thank you," he replied politely. Claire nodded and moved on, but the encounter left her feeling unsettled. She couldn't understand why the man didn't seem upset or offended by what had happened. Most people would have protested or at least shown some sign of frustration, but he hadn't. Instead, he carried himself with an air of quiet dignity that was hard to ignore. Back in the first-class cabin, one of the passengers, a young man in a crisp suit, called Claire over. "Excuse me," he said, lowering his voice. "What happened with that gentleman earlier?" Claire hesitated, unsure how much to say. "There was an issue with his ticket," she replied vaguely. The man raised an eyebrow. "It didn't look like there was an issue. He seemed perfectly calm when he handed it to you." Claire felt her cheeks flush. "It's been resolved," she said curtly, hoping to end the conversation. But the passenger wasn't satisfied. "You know, I think I've seen him before," he mused, glancing toward the back of the plane. "I can't quite place him, but he seems familiar." Claire stiffened at the comment. "I'm sure it's just a coincidence," she said, though her mind raced with possibilities. Who was this man, and why did he seem to leave such an impression on everyone who interacted with him? As the flight continued, the mystery deepened. One of the flight attendants in economy struck up a conversation with the man while serving drinks. She later told Claire that he had been incredibly kind and had even complimented her professionalism. "He seems like such a gentleman," she said. "I don't know what he's doing back there." Claire brushed off the comment, but it only added to her unease. She began to feel the weight of her earlier decision, wondering if she had misjudged him. Then, something unexpected happened. About halfway through the flight, the captain emerged from the cockpit for a quick break. He walked through the cabin, greeting passengers and stretching his legs. When he reached the economy section, his eyes landed on the elderly man. For a moment, the captain froze, his expression one of recognition and disbelief. "Sir," he said, his voice tinged with awe. The man looked up, smiling warmly. "It's been a long time," he said simply. The captain immediately extended his hand, shaking the man's with genuine respect. The interaction was brief, but it didn't go unnoticed. Passengers nearby exchanged curious glances, and even Claire, who had been watching from the galley, felt a pang of uncertainty. When the captain returned to the cockpit, Claire couldn't contain her curiosity any longer. She approached him as he prepared to re-enter. "Do you know that man?" she asked, trying to sound casual. The captain paused, looking at her with a mix of surprise and disappointment. "You mean the gentleman in economy?" Claire nodded. The captain hesitated before responding. "Let's just say you might want to learn more about your passengers before making assumptions." With that, he disappeared into the cockpit, leaving Claire more confused than ever. The rest of the flight passed in a haze. Claire couldn't focus on her duties, her mind consumed with questions about the man in economy. Who was he? Why had the captain reacted that way? And most importantly, had she made a terrible mistake? By the time the plane began its descent, the tension in the air was palpable. Passengers whispered among themselves, the incident from earlier still fresh in their minds. Claire felt a knot of dread forming in her stomach as she prepared for landing, knowing that whatever answers awaited her would not be easily forgotten. As the plane touched down and the passengers began to disembark, Claire found herself lingering near the exit, watching as each person filed past. When the elderly man reached her, he paused, his kind eyes meeting hers once again. "Thank you for the flight," he said, his voice steady and sincere. Claire opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. She watched in silence as the man walked away, disappearing into the bustling terminal. What happened next would leave Claire and everyone else on board stunned, the truth about the man's identity shattering every assumption she had made. Claire stood by the exit door, watching the man's figure fade into the crowd. A heavy unease settled over her as passengers continued to file past, some throwing her glances that felt more judgmental than usual. She tried to shake it off, chalking it up to her imagination, but deep down, she knew this was different. She had crossed a line, and for the first time, she wasn't sure she could justify it. As the crew wrapped up their post-flight duties, the captain approached Claire in the galley. His expression was serious, his usually warm demeanor replaced with something closer to disappointment. "Do you have a moment?" he asked, his voice low but firm. Claire nodded, swallowing hard. The two stepped into a quiet corner of the cabin, away from the rest of the crew. "I need to ask you something," the captain began. "That man, the one in 1A you moved to economy, why did you do it?" Claire hesitated, her mind scrambling for an explanation that wouldn't sound as flimsy as it felt. I wasn't sure if he belonged there," she admitted. "He didn't seem like the typical first-class passenger." The captain's eyes narrowed slightly. "And what exactly does a first-class passenger seem like?" Claire's face flushed. "I didn't mean it that way. It felt unusual. I thought maybe there was an error with his ticket." The captain let out a long sigh, rubbing the back of his neck. "Claire, do you know who that man is?" The question hung in the air, and for a moment, Claire could only shake her head. "His name is Colonel James Hargrove," the captain said finally. "He's a retired Air Force officer, one of the most decorated pilots in the history of this country. He flew countless missions during his service, saved lives, and even trained generations of pilots, myself included." Claire felt her stomach drop. She opened her mouth to respond but found herself speechless. "He's a living legend," the captain continued, his voice tinged with anger. "And you treated him like he didn't deserve to be here." Claire's mind reeled. She thought back to the quiet dignity with which the man had carried himself, even as she had questioned his right to sit in first class. The notebook, the calm way he spoke, the way the captain had recognized him. It all made sense now. "I didn't know." Claire started, but her voice faltered. "That's the problem," the captain said sharply. "You didn't take the time to find out. You judged him based on how he looked, and you made him feel like he didn't belong. Do you have any idea how that reflects on us as a crew?" The captain's words stung, but Claire couldn't argue. She had been so caught up in her assumptions that she hadn't considered the possibility that she was wrong. Later, as the crew disembarked and made their way through the terminal, Claire couldn't stop thinking about Colonel Hargrove. She found herself scanning the crowd, half hoping to catch a glimpse of him, to apologize, to say something, anything, that might make up for what she had done. Meanwhile, in another corner of the terminal, a group of passengers who had been on the flight were gathered near a coffee shop. Among them was the young man in the suit who had first questioned Claire about the incident. He was speaking animatedly with a middle-aged woman who had been seated nearby in first class. "I'm telling you, I've seen that man before," the young man said. "I didn't realize it at first, but when the captain spoke to him, it clicked. He's been in documentaries, articles, he's a big deal." The woman nodded, sipping her coffee thoughtfully. "It's a shame the way he was treated. You could tell he didn't want to make a fuss, but he didn't deserve that." Nearby, another passenger, an older gentleman who had been sitting in economy, chimed in. "I had a chat with him during the flight," he said. "He was incredibly kind. Told me stories about his flying days, but he didn't brag or anything. Just seemed happy to share his experiences." The young man shook his head. "It's a lesson, isn't it? You can't judge someone by appearances. The guy has probably done more in his life than most of us could ever dream of, and yet." Their conversation trailed off as they watched people pass through the terminal, but the sentiment lingered, spreading among those who had witnessed the events on the flight. Back on the plane, Claire sat in the now empty cabin, her mind replaying the day's events. She thought about Colonel Hargrove's calm demeanor, the way he had thanked her even after being treated so poorly. She thought about the captain's words, the passengers' whispers, and the look in the colonel's eyes when she had confronted him. It wasn't just guilt that weighed on her, it was shame. She had prided herself on her professionalism, her ability to handle difficult situations with grace and fairness. But today, she had failed, and there was no undoing it. As the airport lights flickered outside the cabin windows, Claire made a silent bow to herself. She didn't know if she would ever get the chance to apologize to Colonel Hargrove, but if she did, she would make sure he knew how much she regretted her actions. More importantly, she promised herself that she would never let her assumptions dictate her behavior again. The story of the flight quickly spread, carried by the whispers of passengers and the conversations that followed. People shared their impressions of the quiet man in economy, the way he had handled the situation with grace, and the moment the captain had recognized him. But for Claire, the lesson was deeply personal. She didn't need the rumors or the reactions of others to know that she had made a mistake. It was a lesson she would carry with her, one she would never forget, even as the full truth about Colonel Hargrove's life continued to unfold. The tension remained unresolved, a reminder that some mistakes couldn't be easily undone, and that some truths had the power to change everything. The airport buzzed with the usual chaos of arrivals and departures, but Claire's mind was somewhere else entirely. As she walked through the terminal with the rest of the crew, her thoughts lingered on Colonel Hargrove. Every step felt heavier as she replayed the events in her head, the realization of her misjudgment becoming harder to bear. The captain's words echoed in her mind, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she needed to make things right, though she didn't know how. Unbeknownst to Claire, Colonel Hargrove hadn't gone far. After collecting his modest carry-on bag, he had stopped at a small airport cafe, choosing a quiet corner where he could sit unnoticed. Despite everything, he remained calm, his notebook open in front of him as he jotted down a few thoughts. Passengers passed by without a second glance, unaware that the unassuming man sitting there had a story that could fill volumes. Claire, meanwhile, had paused near the exit, her eyes scanning the terminal. She didn't know what she was looking for, maybe a way to distract herself from the weight of her guilt. As she stood there, the young man from first class passed by, nodding in recognition. His face was thoughtful, almost as if he wanted to say something but decided against it. The young man's hesitation didn't last long. He stopped a few paces away, turned back, and approached Claire. "Excuse me," he said. "I know it's probably none of my business, but I can't stop thinking about what happened on the flight." Claire stiffened, unsure how to respond. He held up a hand to stop her. "Look, I'm not here to judge you. But if you're still wondering about that man, I did some digging after we landed. Turns out he's not just a retired pilot. He's a bona fide hero. He flew missions during some of the most dangerous conflicts of the last century. I even found a photo of him receiving a medal from the president. The words hit Claire like a physical blow. She had already suspected she had made a mistake, but hearing it confirmed only deepened her regret. I didn't know, she murmured, more to herself than to the young man. That's just it, he said gently. None of us knew at first, but it's a reminder, isn't it? You can't always tell who someone is just by looking at them. With that, he walked away, leaving Claire standing there, feeling the weight of her actions more heavily than ever. She turned back toward the terminal, her gaze sweeping over the crowd in search of Colonel Hargrove. If there was any chance of finding him, of apologizing, she had to take it. As she moved through the terminal, her heart pounded in her chest. The noise around her faded into the background as she focused on scanning every face, every corner. Finally, near the far end of the concourse, she spotted him. He was sitting alone at a small table, his notebook open in front of him and a cup of tea steaming beside it. For a moment, Claire hesitated. She wasn't sure what she would say or if he would even want to hear it. But something inside her pushed her forward, and before she knew it, she was standing at his table. "Excuse me," she said softly. Colonel Hargrove looked up, his expression calm but curious. "Yes." Claire swallowed hard, the words catching in her throat. I wanted to say I'm sorry. For earlier, I misjudged you, and it was wrong of me." The colonel studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, to her surprise, he smiled. A small, kind smile that seemed to carry more understanding than she deserved. "It takes courage to admit when you're wrong," he said simply. Claire felt a wave of relief, but it was tempered by the knowledge that an apology couldn't erase what had happened. "I should have known better," she said. "I should have treated you with the respect you deserve." The colonel shook his head. "Respect isn't something you give because someone deserves it. It's something you give because it's the right thing to do." His words hit Claire like a second lesson, one she hadn't even realized she needed. She nodded, feeling tears prick at the corners of her eyes. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for your understanding, and for everything you've done." The colonel's smile deepened, and he gestured toward the seat across from him. "Sit for a moment," he said. Claire hesitated but then sat down, feeling a mix of gratitude and nervousness. For the next few minutes, the colonel spoke, sharing stories from his time in the Air Force, stories of bravery, loss, and resilience. Each word painted a picture of a life lived with purpose and humility, a stark contrast to the assumptions Claire had made. As they spoke, other passengers who had been on the flight began to notice. A small group gathered nearby, their curiosity piqued by the sight of the unassuming man and the flight attendant, who seemed transfixed by his words. Whispers spread, and soon, someone approached the table. "Excuse me," the person said. "Are you Colonel Hargrove?" The colonel looked up, nodding politely. "I am." What happened next took everyone by surprise. The person, a man in his 30s, reached out and shook the colonel's hand. "My grandfather served with you," he said. "He always talked about how much he admired you." The colonel's expression softened, and he exchanged a few words with the man. But the moment didn't end there. More people began to approach, each with their own stories, their own connections to the colonel's past. It was as if the quiet man who had been asked to leave first class was suddenly at the center of something much larger, something that couldn't be ignored. Claire watched in awe as the crowd grew, her heart pounding with a mix of emotions. She had set this chain of events into motion, and now she was seeing the full weight of her actions unfold. The tension in the air was palpable as everyone waited to see what would happen next, the sense of anticipation building with each passing moment. The crowd around Colonel Hargrove continued to grow, with murmurs rippling through the terminal. Claire felt a strange mix of emotions as she watched the scene unfold, relief that the colonel's story was finally being recognized, but also a gnawing unease she couldn't quite place. Something about the way people were gathering, their curiosity bordering on frenzy, made her feel like this moment was spiraling out of control. The young man who had first recognized Colonel Hargrove stood nearby, scrolling through his phone. Suddenly, his face lit up with a look of discovery. "Wait a minute," he said, his voice carrying over the hum of conversation. "I just found something incredible." Claire turned to him, her heart skipping a beat. "What is it?" He held up his phone, showing a grainy black and white photo. It depicted a much younger Colonel Hargrove in his military uniform, standing beside a sleek fighter jet. But what caught everyone's attention was the man standing next to him in the photo. A man who looked strikingly similar to the current airport's CEO, whose name was prominently displayed on posters and signage throughout the terminal. "Is that?" someone in the crowd began, trailing off as the realization dawned. The young man nodded. "That's the CEO of this airport, Charles Whitman. Looks like he and the colonel go way back." The buzz of conversation swelled as people began speculating. Claire felt her chest tighten as the implications sank in. If the colonel had such a direct connection to the head of the airport, why hadn't he mentioned it earlier? Why hadn't anyone recognized him sooner? As if on cue, an airport staff member approached the scene, her expression a mix of confusion and urgency. "Excuse me," she said, addressing the colonel. "Are you Colonel James Hargrove?" The colonel looked up, his calm demeanor unwavering. "I am," he replied. The staff member's face flushed slightly. "Mr. Whitman would like to see you in his office. Immediately." A hush fell over the crowd. Claire's pulse quickened as she watched the colonel rise from his seat, gathering his notebook and bag with practiced efficiency. He glanced at the staff member, then at Claire, offering her a brief but meaningful nod. "Thank you for the conversation," he said softly before following the staff member toward the elevators. As the colonel disappeared from view, the tension in the terminal only grew. Passengers whispered among themselves, speculating about what was happening behind closed doors. Claire felt a deep sense of unease. She had already misjudged the colonel once, and now she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to his story than anyone realized. Minutes ticked by, each one stretching longer than the last. Claire found herself pacing near the cafe, her mind racing with questions. Was the colonel in trouble? Had her actions somehow drawn unnecessary attention to him? Or was there a larger story unfolding, one that she couldn't yet see? Finally, the elevator doors slid open, and the colonel stepped out, but he wasn't alone. Walking beside him was Charles Whitman himself, the airport CEO, his usually stern expression replaced with one of warmth and respect. The sight of the two men together stopped Claire in her tracks. As they approached, Whitman addressed the crowd that had gathered. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention. "I want to thank you for your patience and understanding. What you've witnessed today is a testament to the incredible life and legacy of Colonel James Hargrove." He turned to the colonel, placing a hand on his shoulder. "This man is not only a hero but a personal mentor and friend. Many years ago, he trained me as a young pilot, and his guidance shaped the course of my career. It's an honor to have him here today." The crowd erupted into applause, the sound echoing through the terminal. Claire felt a lump form in her throat as she watched the colonel acknowledge the applause with a humble nod. But just as she thought the moment was reaching its peak, Whitman raised a hand to quiet the crowd. "There's something else I need to share," he said, his tone shifting to one of solemnity. "Colonel Hargrove didn't come here today by chance. He was scheduled to meet with me for a very important reason, one that affects all of us." The crowd leaned in, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. Whitman took a deep breath before continuing. "For years, Colonel Hargrove has been advocating for better recognition and support for veterans who transition into civilian life. He's been working tirelessly to ensure that their sacrifices are not forgotten and that they receive the respect and opportunities they deserve. Today, he came to finalize a partnership with this airport to establish a program that will provide jobs and resources for veterans in need." The revelation sent a ripple through the crowd. Claire's heart sank even further as she realized the full extent of her mistake. Not only had she misjudged the colonel, but she had also nearly derailed an initiative that could change countless lives. But before she could fully process her emotions, Whitman added one more bombshell. "Unfortunately," he said, his voice heavy, Due to unforeseen circumstances, the program's launch has been delayed, and I'll be honest, the incident on the flight today hasn't helped matters. The crowd went silent, the weight of Whitman's words settling over them like a cloud. Claire felt as though the ground had been pulled out from under her. She had thought her actions were a personal failing, something she could apologize for and move past. But now, she realized they had far-reaching consequences she hadn't anticipated. As Whitman continued to speak, explaining the details of the program and its potential impact, Claire's mind raced. She had to do something to make this right. But what? The stakes had never been higher, and the resolution felt more out of reach than ever. As the weight of Charles Whitman's words hung heavy in the air, the crowd seemed to hold its collective breath. Claire felt an overwhelming sense of responsibility coursing through her. She couldn't let things end like this, not with the Colonel's initiative teetering on the brink because of her earlier actions. Her heart pounded as she stepped forward, her voice trembling but resolute as she addressed Whitman and the crowd. "Wait," she began, drawing the attention of everyone around her. Her cheeks burned as countless pairs of eyes turned to her, but she pressed on. "I need to say something." Whitman's gaze fell on her, a mixture of curiosity and caution in his expression. Claire hesitated for only a second before continuing. "I was the one who caused the incident on the flight. I misjudged Colonel Hargrove and made assumptions I had no right to make, and because of that, I didn't treat him with the respect he deserved. For that, I'm deeply sorry." The Colonel, standing beside Whitman, regarded her with the same calm dignity he'd shown all along. Claire met his gaze, searching for any sign of anger or disappointment, but all she saw was quiet understanding. Taking a deep breath, Claire turned to the crowd. "But I don't think this story should end with a mistake. What Colonel Hargrove is trying to accomplish with this program is bigger than any one person, and it deserves our full support. If we let one misunderstanding derail something so important, we'll be doing a disservice to the very people who sacrificed the most for us." The crowd murmured in agreement, and Whitman's expression softened. He gave Claire a small nod, acknowledging her courage in stepping forward. Then, to everyone's surprise, Colonel Hargrove stepped up beside Claire. "What happened today isn't just about one person's actions," he said, his voice carrying a quiet strength that silenced the crowd. "It's a reflection of a larger issue, how quick we are to judge each other, how often we forget to look deeper. My goal with this program has always been to build bridges, to remind people of the humanity we all share, no matter our differences." The applause that followed was thunderous, echoing through the terminal and drawing the attention of even more passers-by. But just as it seemed the moment was reaching its resolution, Whitman raised a hand to quiet the crowd again. "There's one more thing you all need to know," he said, his tone serious. "Colonel Hargrove didn't just come here to finalize the veterans program. He also came to share something with me, something he's kept private for a very long time." The crowd fell silent, the suspense building once more. Claire's heart raced as she watched Whitman glance at the Colonel, silently asking permission to continue. The Colonel gave a small nod, his expression unreadable. Whitman took a deep breath before revealing the twist. "Colonel Hargrove is not just a decorated war hero and a mentor to many, including myself. He's also the man who, decades ago, saved my father's life during a critical mission overseas. Without him, I wouldn't be standing here today." The revelation hit like a thunderclap, eliciting gasps from the crowd. Whitman's voice faltered slightly as he continued. "And yet, despite everything he's done for me and my family, he's never once sought recognition or thanks. He's always put others before himself, quietly working to make the world a better place. It's time we repay that kindness by standing behind his vision for this program." The crowd erupted into applause once again, this time louder and more heartfelt than before. Claire felt tears welling up in her eyes as she looked at the Colonel, finally understanding the depth of his humility and the magnitude of his contributions. But just as the applause began to die down, the Colonel raised a hand, signaling that he had something to say. The terminal grew silent once more as he addressed the crowd. "Thank you for your support," he said, his voice steady and sincere. "But if there's one thing I want you to take away from today, it's this. Every single one of us has the power to make a difference. Whether it's through a grand gesture or a small act of kindness, we all have the ability to change someone's life for the better. Don't wait for recognition or the perfect moment. Just do what's right. The simplicity of his words struck a chord with everyone present. Claire felt a renewed sense of purpose as she listened, bowing silently to carry those words with her in everything she did. As the crowd began to disperse, Claire approached the colonel one last time. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "for everything. You've taught me more today than I could have ever imagined." The colonel smiled, a twinkle of warmth in his eyes. "And you've taught me something too," he replied, "that even in our mistakes, there's an opportunity for growth. Don't forget that." With that, he turned and walked away, his presence lingering long after he disappeared into the bustling terminal. Claire watched him go, feeling a sense of closure and a newfound determination to live up to the lesson he had imparted. But as she turned to leave, she caught sight of something on the table where he had been sitting earlier, a small folded piece of paper. She picked it up, her hands trembling slightly as she unfolded it. Inside, written in neat, deliberate handwriting, were the words, "Respect is earned, but kindness is given freely. Always choose kindness." The message was simple, but its impact was profound. As Claire walked away, she felt a sense of hope she hadn't felt in a long time. The events of the day had been unexpected and challenging, but they had also been a reminder of the power of connection, humility, and second chances. And in that moment, she knew she would never forget the man who had taught her that lesson.